Avian influenza is one of the diseases that we're most worried about from a global pandemic standpoint. And this is an interesting disease because initially, when we started to work on influenza viruses, many of them are basically in wild bird populations. They're not causing diseases in birds or people. Those are called low pathogenic avian influenza viruses. And what we have started to see over time is that due to interactions between wild birds and domestic birds, these viruses can start to change. And so when we have wild birds that come in contact with domestic birds and the virus is transferred over to the domestic population, we can see sometimes that the intensification of farming and the certain types of pressures that are on the viruses cause them to evolve and to change over time also. And so low path viruses can become high path viruses. When that happens, we then start to potentially see mortality in poultry flocks, but sometimes the virus even spills back into the wild bird population. What we've seen in doing a lot of telemetry, particularly on waterfowl, is a lot of it in Mongolia, China, and looking at migratory flyways down towards India. What we've seen is that historically, a lot of the migratory birds would make the trip up and over the Himalayas and into India. What we started to notice with some of our more recently tagged birds is that birds don't migrate to India anymore. They stop on the northern slope of the Himalayas. What we saw is that there are new wetlands that are forming on the northern side of the Himalaya, and this is a result of glacial runoff and increased climate perturbations that are leading to new wetlands being available. And the birds have figured out that there's not really a need to make that larger trip, that longer trip, to be able to overwinter in wetland habitats. And so just by definition, if those birds are migrating to one place or another place, a new place, due to issues of climate change or changes in ecological systems that are available to them, this automatically dictates to us that we may have a change in the dynamics of the disease ecology. And so really, in a way, we need to start looking at a coordinated response that allows us to understand, in this case, bird migration, the potential for migratory flyways or corridors to be linked to possible introduction of the virus. But at the same time, we need to try to take precautions and keep, as best as possible, domestic birds and wild birds from coming into contact. Now, in some places, that can be done through management and housing. In other cases, we know, particularly in domestic duck farms, these large flocks are grazed on rice paddies that have been already cut. That it's really not possible to keep them completely separated. And so in those cases, we have to have an increased vigilance and sensitivity of our surveillance system so that we can then be on top of something that might be happening, mortality or transmission dynamics, and really prevent it from going any further and spilling back into eventually people. So there's a role for all the ministries to collaborate, to cooperate, and I think that this is part of our One Health approach at a global level. You know, bushmeat represents a really interesting, challenging issue for us to look at and to address. On one hand, we recognize that bushmeat serves as a source of food security, a source of protein, a source of good nutrients for many local communities. And in fact, many of the people that rely on bushmeat actually are people that have poor income or low income, or they really need it for sustaining themselves. It's not necessarily a luxury product for them, it's something they need to survive. And so in those cases, we need to understand that the pressure on wildlife populations due to hunting and consumption of local meat products that are wild-based, this is something these people need just to survive on a day-to-day basis. The flip side of that, and what you see in some of the urban centers all around the world, is access to this wild meat. But there, it's a luxury product. There, people are paying top dollar at fancy restaurants to be able to say that they've eaten this animal or that animal. And I think that, you know, when we look at sort of the global situation surrounding bushmeat and pressure on wildlife populations, we need to think about what people need for sustainability, for survival, as far as food security and nutrition. If we can't identify alternative food resources for people, we have to expect that at least at a local level, there may be some consumption that is needed for people to survive. In the larger, more complex value chains associated with movement of meat to high-end restaurants, this is an area where maybe we have room for improvement, and we could address that in a different way. In Africa, one of the biggest challenges I think that we face at a continental level is balancing the needs of pastoralist communities, ecosystems, and the human population dynamics. We recognize that culturally, pastoralism is a way of life for many, many people. In the last few years, we've particularly been challenged by repeated severe drought. The drought has led to poor productivity of grazing lands, water shortages for drinking for animals as well as people, but particularly on the grazing areas that these pastoralists rely on, food is not available for their animals. And so in certain parts of Africa, people have lost 50 to 75% of their livestock, which then is essentially their whole livelihood. So people have actually lost the ability to generate money or to even have money to buy food, and the animals themselves are no longer producing milk. So they really have lost a significant amount of value. When we look at the pressures on the pastoralist communities, besides the change in the climatic conditions, besides the drought, besides the lack of food resources for the animals or the crops for people to eat, the other thing that we see is that rangelands and grazing areas are shrinking. And this has to do, to a large extent, with the population dynamics of Africa. We see many countries really having large numbers of people. Cities are getting bigger. People are expanding in their use of the habitat. There's more encroachment even on natural areas, potentially protected areas, but even non-protected areas that are traditionally forested areas. We really see a need to figure out how to better balance the use of the remaining land resources, the use of the remaining grazing lands, but particularly we need to also figure out how to balance and help the challenges of the pastoralists, because from a cultural standpoint, this is a tradition for thousands of years. This is a way of life for these people. Maybe we need to think of some alternative ways that we can support them, providing them with alternative food resources, identifying ways to have access to more water in traditionally challenging places, providing seeds to allow them to grow more crops for themselves, but also for their livestock. So it's a really complicated issue. It's really a One Health issue. It requires land use management. It involves dimensions related to ecological systems, availability of feed, and really it also is very much affected by climate issues these days, particularly with the drought being so severe, so persistent, and year after year, particularly in the northern Horn of Africa. I think One Health is a very relevant approach and a relevant way to address and achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. We know that life on Earth, life on sea, food security, poverty alleviation, all of the things that we speak about for supporting developing countries and moving them up and forward to a happier and healthier life, these are all parts of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And to do this, we really need a multi-sectoral approach.